The last presentation by Jens Bley from Germany focuses on the concept of culturally enhanced smart city services. This is all about cooperation between municipal, cultural, and commercial people. He has this to highlight through example of initiative. Jens Bley from Germany is managing partner at Living Labs, Germany. He holds graduate degrees from the University of Arts in Berlin and from the University of Florida. He is an active member of the Hamburg Chamber of Commerce at the e-business advisory group and at the Open Data Advisory Group.
Thank you so much. I wish, from a tech point of view, I could use sensors and put them onto the pulse of a city, but I won't do that. I'll open the scope again to something which is more probably business-related, but also offers chances for cultural institutions. So what I'm talking about is culturally enhanced smart city services. Living Labs, for your understanding, observes what innovations happen in cities and what is transferable to other cities, so things don't have to be reinvented as services every time, everywhere. And also gives a platform for entrepreneurs, small and medium enterprises to show their solution that they have probably had in Barcelona or London or anywhere, to transfer them to Hamburg, Berlin, and other places. This accumulates every year in the Living Labs Global Award, and it might be interesting for you that in the last Living Labs Global Award, with about 25 cities participating, with a call to have help from mobile or web-based services, usually from small and medium enterprises, there was only one call focusing on culture. There's a bit of culture in many of the calls, for example, in tourism calls, but it's just a subset of what's happening. Usually calls are about mobile health, about transport, about tourism in general. There was only one call that focused on culture, and that came from Finland, and was actually a little bit more about museum apps and translation in there. So what I want to do today is, we can complain about that. There's only one out there, but we can also take it as a chance, and we can see that we are just part of an entire ecosystem in a city, and this ecosystem can be described, and we can look for opportunities, and I want to take you through that, because there are also blocks, there are roadblocks on the path to that. So when I talk about culturally enhanced smart city services, what does it actually mean? What are we calling for? First and foremost, we're not looking for a technological solution. We want to reach new audiences. Every single organization in the cultural domain has their own audience, and they all strive for finding new audiences. But where do they come from? Where is that? Is it cannibalizing yourself? Are you competing with other cultural organizations? Or do you have to go into a different flow of looking for your audiences? Secondly, the word itself, enhancing, means no, you're not at the center of the universe, you're part of the universe. And so you enhance maybe some other services with your cultural input, and that has a perspective for you, but it also has a perspective for other smart city services. Thirdly, cities are a complex system, a very complex system. And again, I say I'd love to have a sensor on the pulse of stakeholders in cities. So how can you collaborate within a very complex system? And we'll look at a couple of examples here. And fourthly, yes, cultural organizations will have to engage in new business models. They are actually, as we will see later on, not that new. They are just from other disciplines, as am I. I'm not from a cultural institution. My background is, besides what just been explained, I'm actually by heart a producer. I've had one of the earliest internet companies in Germany. I've produced edutainment programs for immersive kid media with National Geographic, and so we are used to reaching audiences, and we get measured by if we do or we don't, and that is something we have to look into as well. So there are very spectacular ways of reaching audiences, and now this is a single organization way of reaching new audiences. The British Museum on the 18th of June last year did something very smart. Not a smart city way, but a smart way. what they did was they broadcast out of the Pompeii Live a very spectacular collaboration basically between the Pompeii resources here in Italy and the British Museum, and they broadcast live into more than 250 cinemas in the UK. On that night, they were the second best grossing cinema event, beating many Hollywood films on that night. And they reached more than 35,000 audiences, and they had 500,000 accompanying Facebook activities. They had followers coming in through the social media activities. Next morning, on the 19th, they actually broadcast again into the cinemas, but a children's version, a school version, tying into the curriculum. So they started finding a new pathway of communicating with audiences, potentially new audiences. For your background, and we've heard it this morning from Rob from DMA, it is not so much the one-time visitor, it's a repeat visitor. And the British Museum, for example, they have just about 6 million visitors per year. Most of them come once in a lifetime, and they spend 2 or 3 hours until they realize that there was so much more to see. So inspiring by having a kind of a broadcast event is one way of dealing with getting in touch with your audience. It's just one way. It also shows that a cultural organization has to somewhat change internally, because suddenly you act as a publisher, you act as a broadcaster. That's not what you're trained to do. So British Museum, for example, and they were followed as an example by Victoria and Albert Museum with a beautiful topic, David Bowie. They reached a lot younger audience with Pompeii. And what's happening on the 24th of April, they will have a live broadcast about the Vikings, another set of audiences as well. But today we're talking about the smart cities, and we're talking about reaching audiences in that domain. So I come from a port city, and 10 years ago we had 30,000 cruise ship passengers coming to our port. Now we're facing just about 1 million. 10 years later, just 1 million, and almost forgotten potential over time. So how do we reach out to, and when we talk about audiences, we from broadcast, television, or you name it, we know about fragmented audiences. Yes, we like to go for the mass, but we like to add audiences, so we have to be very specific. And who do you want to reach? So cruise ship passengers is one of those that, for example, in Hamburg, we really want to reach. Secondly, we want to reach business travelers who have spare time. You know yourself that you have 1 or 2 or 3 hours to spend before you head back to the airport, before you have your next meeting. So there is value time, a value proposition that we can make from a cultural point of view. And that is something where we want to tie in, and we are tying in. It's not a plan, it's piloting and so forth. And let's not forget, we've got tons of citizens in the leisure mode. They might be working and have a couple of hours, or they might just be spending on the weekend. So we can target those as well. How do we do that? First of all, I said we are not at the center of the universe from a cultural point of view. You are most of the time in your day, but in reality we are not. We are just one part of that ecosystem. So what is actually in need of a business traveler, of a cruise ship passenger, even of somebody who is leisurely in a leisure mode? They have to get from A to B for a reason. There is some kind of mobility. So we as cultural networks, institutions, so forth, we can first of all feed into mobility services, permitting not only a reason, but time to get from A to B, use it wisely, from our cultural institutions. So why don't we tie into the mobility services as they're being offered? And we see many apps and solutions being on the market right now, doing multimodal, intermodal form of transportation, using public transport, hopping into a taxi, into a bike taxi, using share bike systems and so forth. And these, for example, in Hamburg, there are 3 offerings right now, including the biggest partners in town. And so there's the reason to tie in from a cultural point of view. And yes, and that make sure that that limited time that people have is spent in its best way. We had one of our competition winners is a Dutch company that is now in Germany as well, and they came from the carpooling world, and they have now distributed with the help of the Senate and the largest taxi company and the bike sharing and so forth, they've got an app going and a service going that ties in tourist in motion. So people come into town and need to go from A to B or find out what is from A to B. What's the best way? What's the most economic way? What is the most ecological way? And then tie in with the content of cultural institutions. What is happening there in depth? Is it interesting for me? Have I seen it before? Is it an exhibition that has been transferred? So this is an example of tying into a emerging smart city service. And the benefit is that there suddenly are maybe 10, 15, 20, 30 players out there that will make use of your not only cultural content, but also on the metadata, not on the metadata from a data point of view, from a metadata about your own organization, not just the location, but accessibility, the pricing, the special edition, the curator's walk, and so forth. Yet, as I said, the ecosystem of a city is troublesome. And the ecosystem of a city is not the city itself, it's a lot of players as stakeholders, or as we could call them in the future, cultural agents in a cultural network who have a say in some kind of ownership on what is happening in a smart city service. Now, we always have the municipal administration. There are lander rights for any kind of distribution of information. There are the city tourist organizations. The city tourist organization in Hamburg, for example, is an interesting organization. They are owned by the city, but they have their own bottom line to answer to. So they actually also deliver money into the city. So they have a huge amount of independence. So what are they concerned about when small and medium or even non-profit or profit organizations want to deal with touristic information? They first of all say no, because they want to have the ownership of the end-client relationship. They want to be the ones who go through the ticketing. They want to be the ones who have the final relationship between the tourists coming into town. They're not quite interested in sharing, but they learn and things will change. Again, in a summary, for a smart city, you need smart people, and you need smart people at different organizational levels, and they have to connect. Otherwise, it is a very, very, very troublesome road. Then most of the cities, at least in Germany, have city portals. Now we have an interesting combination in Hamburg. We have a city portal that is partially owned by the city, but is actually run by a private company, by one of the largest publishing houses. So they want a piece of the cake. When they offer citizen services, they want to be involved in the actual revenue sharing at the end of the day. But also we have the Public Transport Corporation, and we'll see in the next example I'll show you why that is so important. And the urban furniture companies, I'm sure you're aware of that most of the urban furniture, bus stops and so forth, are actually owned and given to cities with a guarantee payment on top for the sole use, exclusive use for advertising on behalf of that commercial company. JCDecaux is one of the largest ones, as we know, out of France. There are other ones, I don't have to name them. But they own the space where people actually have time to spend, except for a very small portion of that bus stop that actually belongs to the city, or to be precise, to the public transport company, with the schedule, the timetable. And that is a very important, because it's actually relevant information at a location that you can tie into. You have cultural content owners. The cultural content owners have a right. They might not want to distribute for free. They might not all operate under Creative Commons. So you have to inspire them. Why should they provide cultural information? And you have the service providers who, at the end of the day, have to make some kind of money. Let me point you to one of the organizations that have actually won, I believe, Clemens is now 5 or 6 Living Labs Global Awards in different cities. And I just want to use that as an example how complex things are and how easy they can be made. But Connect Things basically focuses on near-field communication and QR code reading to enable cities to be smart, meaning that they will distribute all their tags across the city onto urban furniture, as we see on the right-hand side in Nice. So you can follow the footsteps of Matisse throughout Nice as one of the examples. But you also get all kinds of different city information depending on the level of the tie-in of a company like Connects Things and the city itself. But just alone, talking about the one bus stop here, you can now see there are 2 or 3 or 4 players that you have to deal with in terms of getting permission, getting the right content, getting the distribution, getting the access point. And yes, also between the cities, and we're just in the process of rolling out some of those services in Hamburg and Berlin. So we really know where some of the stop-goers are. And what we've decided for Hamburg, and that brings me back to culturally enhanced smart city services, what we've decided in Hamburg that we'll be feeding in all the information from protected buildings, and we have a system in Hamburg which is called the Blue Shield. So on all these protected buildings, and we've got hundreds of them. Overall, we have got a lot more worthwhile buildings to be looked at. There are blue shields with basic information, being a great area for tags to be positioned, for people to actually trace the city from a historic point of view, from an architectural point of view. And that goes into a database repository, and I'll show you a little bit about that. And so then Connect Things, but also other companies and organizations can tie into these data repositories and feed their own version of the smart city services or contribute. In Nice, for example, it ties into the shared bike system. That's in Hamburg again. That's a very, very upcoming mean of transportation. So there's a point of relevance. Where do you go? What do you find around yourself? And what is maybe the best way to travel the so-called Art Mile in Hamburg, which is about only 3 or 4 kilometers, but there are 3 stops for the shared bikes. So how do you tie in with that from a cultural point of information? I mentioned business models, and I've done the strategy for the Hamburg Museum of Art for how to get into the digital domain over the next 3 years, and they've budgeted very nicely. We've actually organized the money from a third party. We convert them partially into something which is called a publisher and a broadcaster at some stage, but also money that comes from public environments usually tends to run out after 3 or 4 years. So whatever we do needs to be sustainable. So you have to get used to thinking about new business models that are new to you and not necessarily new to other fields. One of them is, of course, reach. There's so much valuable content out there, and anything, even NFC tags, whatever, are somewhat dark fiber. They are not connected to the content itself in the first place, but through the content it gets very, very valuable. So you create actually reach for third parties, for the part of the advertising, and there's revenue sharing to be made, even for cultural institutions. From the internet business, we know, and this is just one example, we know click-throughs. So there are ways of finding sustainable, fragmented revenue sources, and as we all know, they will just be fragmented. It'll just be one part out of a whole sum in that equation. Licensing, we're looking at premium services that will be tagged on to mobility services, so you can have a very raw mobility service just to get you from A to B to C with the ecological footprint or the price or the time, but with a premium service you get all those, you can get all those additional information, and it depends on the service provider if they want to have it premium or if they want to have it as a freebie. And that's where you find a chance as cultural organization or as a network of cultural organizations to tie into that business model. But commission bartering or brand awareness is a key for some of our organizations. They really want to be out there to be attractive to the cruise ship passengers. How do you do that? How do you tie in? And so therefore it's really about learn business models from other segments and engage people who've been in these models. But there's also something that is a must, we feel, and Hamburg is just on the way to it. It's the open data and the open content principle. Now, being a German city, and we Germans love laws, right? So what did the mayor do first thing when he was elected? He passed a law, and is basically a directive, and it has two components. One of it is a transparency law. It's against corruption, so that's in line with the EU about anti-corruption. Transparency meaning all contracts between private entities and the public have to be published, basically, have to be visible. But the second part is more interesting for our case here. And I co-chair the Open Data Supervisory Board in the Chamber of Commerce. And the Chamber of Commerce in Germany is a mandatory one, so every enterprise has to be in there. And if you've got 5 companies, you've got 5 memberships. So we do represent the private sector very strongly. And so the second part of the law was all the ministries and the associated enabled organizations will have to provide data under the open data information. So open data obviously is quite easy in terms of transport and logistics and so forth, but we said, hang on, the Ministry of Culture, you have to deliver open data as well. So open data in that case is nothing to do with who is where and how many people are using, but we're talking about content. So how do we feed in open data, open content from a cultural point of view into the open data portal? And that's happening by the end of this year, that there will be a lot of sets of access to cultural content and access content, including the information of the protected buildings that will feed in for anybody to use commercially or non-commercially. Because that's the other part, the open data portal in Hamburg is the CC0 requirement, and there was a long way to go for. On the other hand, it's not just, you just can't wait. Even as a city, you have to contribute yourself. So the Ministry of Culture in Hamburg now has really gotten into a e-culture agenda 2020. And so the pilot projects of showing to not only to citizens and tourists, but especially to administration itself and to enabling organizations or enabled organizations, what can happen with their content and how it can play out, and there's a piloting phases. So we are currently connecting, as we call all the dots, the culture dots in Hamburg. So it'll be part like street museum, but it'll also be the total repository of archaeological finding sites. So very interesting connected cultural information that then again mobile service providers or people like Connect Things can tie in and say, this is the content that we would like to have access to because it has a meaning for our future clients, which is basically the future audiences of what you do. So that's what we are up to right now. But there are hurdles, and I just want to summarize that. It really boils down to, can you find a grip on who owns the customer or user relationship? Can you find a way that the transport organization, for example, who likes to own the relationship for anybody using mobility, or the tourist organization who likes to own the relationship with anybody who comes in as a tourist and they're expanding it to leisure citizens as well, can you find a way in between where you share that kind of ownership, or you deliver new audiences as SME, for example, or can you find a model where you enable these organizations and you're yourself a part of that revenue sharing momentum? And then, which is not trivial at all, and I asked Rob, who was here this morning, and he had a presentation yesterday, because he's on the 2RML group and so forth, who aggregates the content in a multiple contributor and service provider setting? It is not that trivial, because otherwise you would just go through a city portal. So how do you make it accessible? And that's one of the biggest issues that we have right now, is how do you make it a multimodal access to interesting content, and how can you have not 25 access points to something, but maybe just 3 or 4 or 5, and who runs those access points? So I can't come up with a solution. I can only come up with perspectives from a media producing innovator and smart city perspective, but I can only encourage you to put a lot of pressure through the open data, also onto city administrations, and if you're a cultural organization, be daring enough, have the guts to try out new ways of reaching audiences and supporting, for example, mobile service providers with your content for a reason that you learn yourself. And with that note, I'll leave you to enhance your own smart city services.